Why did they laugh when she didn't flinch? Why did their cruel words slide off her like rain on armor? The mud was thick that morning, the kind that clung to boots and uniforms, the kind that made every movement feel heavier. Recruits at Fort Davidson were supposed to be broken down here, stripped of whatever pride they had carried in with them, remade into soldiers who could withstand humiliation and pain. That was the point of this yard: mud, sweat, and submission. But Casey Brennan hadn't come here to break. The shove came fast, deliberate, the kind of calculated cruelty that carried a smile with it. Blake Harrison towered over her, boots planted like he owned the ground, his grin sharp enough to cut. Around him, the circle of recruits tightened. Some laughed, others just watched, their silence the kind of complicity that fed bullies and made cruelty louder. Casey landed hard in the mud, her uniform torn at the sleeve. For a second she lay still, listening to the laughter. Then the fabric shifted on her collarbone, and the ink that she usually kept hidden surfaced like a secret unwilling to stay buried. The butterfly. Black lines etched in precise strokes, wings spread in quiet defiance. Blake had been waiting for this. His eyes lit up, his grin widened. "That butterfly," he sneered, "that's gonna get crushed in a real war, sweetheart." The words were cruel, but more than cruel, they were dismissive, a verdict before the trial had even begun. Laughter rippled through the circle. But Casey didn't scramble, didn't curse, didn't cry. She rose, slow and fluid, brushing mud from her knees as if she had all the time in the world. Her movements carried something unfamiliar here: control, discipline, grace. She stood eye to eye with Blake, her hands steady, her face calm. "You done?" The words were so quiet the morning wind nearly stole them. For the first time, Blake faltered, just for a heartbeat. He stepped back without meaning to, as though something in her gaze had shoved him harder than he'd shoved her into the mud. But pride wouldn't let him stay silent. "Done, princess, I'm just getting started. See that little decoration?" He gestured at her collarbone with mock reverence. "That might impress your art school friends, but this is where warriors are made, not little girls playing dress-up." The laughter that followed was louder this time, sharper. Recruits sensed blood in the water. Casey didn't move, didn't fire back. She let it roll over her. Only her hand shifted just slightly, almost unconsciously. Her fingers touched the butterfly's wing, tracing it with a gesture so small no one thought twice. But her thumb found the scar. Tiny, almost invisible, buried in the ink like a flaw in the artist's design. And in that scar lived a memory none of them could see. 6 voices, 6 lives, 6 names etched into her skin more deeply than the ink. They thought it was decoration. They thought it was weakness. They thought wrong. She didn't speak, because some truths don't need words. The circle eventually broke. The recruits moved on, as though mocking a butterfly had been enough to satisfy them. Blake strutted, chest out, savoring the applause of laughter, never realizing the danger in the silence she left behind. Casey turned back to the yard, mud clinging to her boots, uniform torn, but eyes sharper than ever. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, something no one here was ready to see. Hours later, the hum of diesel engines replaced the laughter. The maintenance bay was alive with the noise of machines, clanging tools, the sharp bark of orders echoing off steel walls. Most recruits groaned about grease under their nails, the weight of wrenches, the complexity of Abrams tanks. But Casey moved like she belonged inside the steel beast, as though every bolt and hydraulic line whispered secrets to her alone. Drill Sergeant Murphy noticed. He always noticed. "Brennan," his voice cut through the clatter. She slid out from beneath the Abrams, grease on her uniform, rag in hand. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." Murphy circled her, shark-like, boots clicking on concrete. "You just ran a full diagnostic on this tank in 47 minutes. His scowl deepened. "The manual says it takes at least 2 hours for a qualified mechanic. You want to explain that to me?" The bay went still. Conversations froze. Even Blake stopped pretending to fight with a stuck bolt, craning his neck to watch. Casey's face didn't change. Her voice was level. I followed the manual. Maybe I read faster than average. Laughter snickers. Murphy's eyes narrowed. Reading faster, right? Then maybe you can explain how you knew to check the turret drive without the troubleshooting chart, or how you identified a hydraulic leak by sound alone from 30 feet away. Casey could feel every pair of eyes on her, suspicion, doubt. She could tell the truth. She could tell him about the desert nights spent keeping Abrams alive under fire, about the sound of leaking hydraulics burned into her memory, because it had once meant the difference between survival and death. But the truth wasn't hers to give. Not here, not yet. Lucky guess, drill sergeant. Murphy stared at her, jaw tight. For a moment, silence pressed down like a weight. Then he nodded toward the tank. Lucky guess, huh? Let's see how lucky you are when this Abrams needs to pass inspection in 6 hours. Any mistake falls on you, Brennan. Don't forget that. He walked away, leaving whispers in his wake. Not laughter this time, something darker, suspicions, doubts. Blake found his smirk again. Beginner's luck, he announced. That's all it was. Give her something real, watch her fold. But not everyone bought it. Austin Rodriguez, working on the next tank, had seen her hands. The certainty. The way she moved, not guessing but knowing. He'd seen her fingers graze the butterfly tattoo when Murphy pressed harder, like she was drawing strength from something they couldn't see. And he had questions. The kind of questions that don't fade. 3 days later, rain fell across the obstacle course in sheets, turning dirt into rivers, ropes into traps, and walls into waterfalls. It was the kind of storm designed to break spirits before the whistle even blew. Casey stood on the line with 11 others, uniform soaked, hair plastered to her face, poncho useless. The butterfly was hidden beneath fabric, but she felt its weight pressing, reminding, warning. Listen up, maggots, Murphy's voice roared across the storm. This course is designed to break you. Half of you will fail, the other half will wish you had. Blake stood 3 down from her, lips curling into a silent word, princess. The whistle screamed. They surged forward, boots slipping on mud. Ropes slick with rain sent recruits crashing down, swearing, clawing for grip. Casey's movements were measured, efficient. No wasted effort. Austin watched her again, even as he fought his own battle with the storm. She moved like she'd done this course before, like she'd memorized every inch. But then the sound came. Helicopter rotors, faint at first, then louder, slicing through the storm. For most, it was background noise, training atmosphere, nothing more. For Casey, it was war. She hit the ground in one fluid movement, sliding behind concrete barriers before her mind had time to catch up. Her body knew before thought could intervene. Her hands braced, eyes sharp, breath controlled, cover, conceal, survive. By the time the others registered the sound, she was already moving again, back on her feet, eyes forward. Austin saw it, the reflex, the kind you didn't learn in boot camp, the kind you only earned when rotor blades had once meant incoming fire and hesitation had meant death. He said nothing, but he knew. And in that silence, suspicion grew into something heavier. The course ended with the wall, 30 feet of smooth concrete, rope slick like grease, handholds treacherous. One by one, recruits failed, fell, cursed, clawed. Casey reached it with a lead that should have been impossible. And Blake made his choice. A rope frayed, a handhold slicked, a fall engineered with quiet malice. She crashed into the mud from 20 feet up, breath gone, pain sharp. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. The yard went silent. Then, with the same grace that had carried her through mud and laughter, she rose, checked for damage, stood tall. Blake sneered. Tough break, princess. Maybe next time, focus on staying on the rope instead of showing off. The words hung like smoke. Casey didn't defend, didn't accuse. She faced Murphy, voice steady despite the mud clinging to her uniform. "I'd like to run it again, drill sergeant." Gasp silence, even Blake faltered. Murphy shook his head. "Brennan, you just fell 30 feet. You should be in medical, not begging for seconds." "I'm fine, drill sergeant. I'd like to run it again." Something in her tone made even the storm pause. And she ran it again. This time she broke the facility record by 47 seconds, without ropes, without excuses, scaling the wall with hands and will alone. At the top, she looked down at Blake. Her voice carried just enough for him to hear. "Lucky guess, right?" But even as the storm swallowed her triumph, Casey knew. The whispers had grown louder, the eyes sharper, every display of skill another nail in the coffin of her cover story. And beneath her uniform, the butterfly burned against her skin, whispering the truth she couldn't speak. 6 named, 6 ghosts, 6 promises. And a war she couldn't afford to lose. What happens when silence becomes more dangerous than words? When holding back the truth feels like betrayal, but speaking it could destroy everything. Casey felt the weight of those questions pressing against her chest as she walked off the obstacle course, mud clinging to her uniform, body aching, heart steady. She had won the record, humiliated Blake, silenced the whispers for now. But silence only lasted so long. The storm had shifted, and now it was moving toward her. Inside the barracks, recruits peeled off soaked uniforms and swapped stories about their battle with the rain and ropes. Some cursed the storm, others cursed themselves, but most saved their sharpest words for Casey. "Who runs it twice, show off. No way she's clean, nobody moves like that. She's hiding something." The whispers were knives in the dark. She didn't flinch, didn't answer, didn't even look up from polishing her boots. But every word was another stitch in the net tightening around her. Blake sat across the room, his smirk returning. His sabotage had failed, but in his mind she had given him something better. A new angle, fuel for suspicion. Austin Rodriguez sat near the back, watching in silence. He hadn't spoken to her since the course, but he couldn't shake the image of her reflex to the helicopter sound. It had been perfect, too perfect. He wanted to ask her, wanted to understand, but some instincts told him the answers might be heavier than either of them were ready for. And Casey just sat polishing her boots, each stroke steady, methodical, her thoughts far from the barracks. Because every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see Fort Davidson. She saw the desert. 18 months ago, a heat that burned skin raw, sand that swallowed footprints before you could trace them, the acrid taste of gunpowder mixed with sweat. Task Force Shadow, 6 soldiers, 1 mission, and a betrayal that none of them saw coming. Casey could still hear the last breath of Private Anderson, the youngest of them, his voice breaking as he said her name before silence took him. She could still see Sergeant Kim dragging Tors toward the extraction point, only for both to vanish in a wall of fire. And she could still feel the butterfly taking shape on her collarbone weeks later, ink pressed into skin, each line carved with the weight of memory. 6 names hidden in its wings, a memorial disguised as decoration. To the world it was nothing, to her it was everything. She opened her eyes. The barracks noise returned. The storm outside pounded against the windows. And she polished her boots one last time. Morning brought new orders. The recruits assembled in the briefing room, the air heavy with stale coffee and the impatience of men and women who were still learning the rhythm of obedience. Drill Sergeant Murphy stood at the front, arms crossed, his face locked in that perpetual scowl that could mean anything: disappointment, pride, or simply the shape his face had frozen into after decades of discipline. But it was Murphy who made Casey's pulse quicken. It was Instructor Logan Price. He wasn't like Murphy. He didn't shout, didn't bark. His authority was quieter, sharper. A scalpel where Murphy was a hammer. He sat behind the desk, Casey's personnel file spread open in front of him, flipping through the pages with the slow patience of a man who enjoyed peeling back layers. "Recruit Brennan," he said without looking up, "front and center." Her boots echoed against the tile as she stepped forward. Every recruit's eyes followed her. Blake's smirk widened. Price looked up, finally meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his words cut like wire. Tank maintenance, perfect scores, obstacle course, facility records, weapons qualification, expert marksman on the first attempt, navigation, 98% accuracy in conditions that challenge veterans. Each word dropped like a stone. "Tell me," Price said, leaning back, "how does someone with no military background perform better than most of my instructors?" The silence stretched. Casey stood tall, hands behind her back, eyes forward. "I study hard, sir. I pay attention to detail." Price laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Study hard," he shook his head. "That explains it, does it? Reading manuals faster than anyone else. Moving like you've seen death when all you've done is train for 3 weeks." His eyes narrowed. "You want to know what I see when I look at you, Brennan? I see someone with experience. Experience that isn't in this file. Experience that raises security concerns." The room was still. The recruits leaned forward. Blake's smirk froze, replaced by something sharper: hunger. Casey's throat felt dry. She could feel the butterfly tattoo burning against her collarbone, pressing like a brand. The urge to speak was strong. To tell him the truth. To tell him about 6 soldiers who had died screaming her name, about the conspiracy that had brought her here. But truth wasn't an option, not yet. "I'm here to serve, sir, same as everyone else." Price leaned forward, his eyes cutting straight through her. "No, not the same as everyone else. You've seen something, something you can't hide from your own eyes." Her jaw tightened, she didn't answer. Price closed the file with a snap. "Effective immediately, I'm recommending you for discharge. Suspicion of fraudulent enlistment, security concerns, failure to provide accurate background information." The words hit harder than the 20-foot fall into mud. Discharge meant the end of her mission, the end of justice for her 6. She kept her face steady, but inside something cracked. 6 hours, that's what he gave her. 6 hours before Commander Sullivan signed the papers. 6 hours to salvage everything, or lose it all. When she stepped outside, the sunlight felt wrong. Too bright, too sharp. The world was still moving, recruits laughing, drill sergeants shouting, trucks rolling across the lot, but Casey felt time narrowing, funneling her toward one unavoidable moment. She walked past Blake, who stood with 2 others, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Told you, Princess was never real, just a fraud in uniform." She didn't stop, didn't look at him, but every word sank into the mud already weighing her down. In the distance, Austin watched her walk. He saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw. Something was unraveling, something bigger than training. He wanted to follow, wanted to ask, but he stayed where he was. Because some storms aren't yours to walk into. That night, Casey sat alone in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. 6 hours felt like 6 minutes. Every second was a countdown to the end of her mission. She thought about telling Price everything. She thought about breaking cover, but that would alert the people she was hunting, tip them off that someone was closing in. And the 6 she carried on her skin deserved better than failure. Her hand rose to the butterfly, tracing its wings. Michael Torres, David Kim, Janet Rodriguez, Marcus Williams, Amanda Chen, Thomas Anderson. 6 named, 6 promises. She whispered their names into the dark, her voice breaking for the first time in weeks. And then she closed her eyes. Tomorrow the hearing. Tomorrow the end. Unless something broke the silence before silence broke her. The next morning, the world broke itself. The sound came first. Rotors, not the dull rhythm of training helicopters, something sharper, urgent. Casey's body reacted before her mind. Muscles coiled, eyes scanned exits, instinct roared awake. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. The discharge hearing had just started when the sound grew louder, closer, filling the air outside Commander Sullivan's office. Through the window, soldiers moved with sharp urgency, not training rhythm. Real urgency, real operations. Blake's smirk froze. Sullivan's pen paused mid-signature. Price glanced at the window. And Casey felt her cover burning away. Because some instincts cannot be hidden. Not when the war comes knocking on the parade ground. What happens when the past walks straight into the room you've been hiding from it? What happens when silence can no longer protect you, and exposure feels like the only truth left? Casey's boots echoed in the narrow hallway leading to Commander Sullivan's office. Every step sounded like a countdown, each beat a reminder that her mission, her cover, her purpose, had 6 hours left to live. She had pressed her uniform to perfection. She had braided her hair so tightly it hurt. She had polished her boots until she could see fragments of herself in them. But all of it felt like ceremony for a funeral. Her own. At the door, Blake Harrison waited with 2 other recruits. His eyes glittered with triumph he barely bothered to conceal. He dressed sharper than usual, boots cleaned for the occasion, uniform snug, every crease a weapon aimed at her. "Guess this is it, Princess," he muttered under his breath as she passed. "Some of us belong here, some of us don't." She didn't answer, didn't even glance at him. Silence was her only shield. But inside, the butterfly tattoo felt like fire against her skin, as if her 6 weren't willing to let her go quietly. The office was sterile, metal desk, files stacked in neat rows, a clock ticking far too loudly. Commander Brooks Sullivan sat behind the desk, his gray hair cropped to regulation perfection, his expression carved from stone. Beside him, Instructor Price leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes sharp with the kind of certainty that made Casey's stomach twist. "Recruit Brennan," Sullivan began, not looking up from her file. "You stand accused of providing false information during enlistment, demonstrating knowledge and skills inconsistent with your stated background, and raising security concerns regarding your true identity." Each charge fell like a hammer. "Do you have a response?" Casey opened her mouth. The words she had prepared were cold, safe, designed to deny without defending. The kind of words that preserved dignity, even as they cut the rope of her mission. But then the sound came. Rotors. Close, too close. The low chop of a helicopter skimming the parade ground. Her body reacted before her mind. Shoulders tightened, muscles coiled. Eyes flicked to exits, corners, cover, instinct pure and immediate, the predator stirring inside her no longer hidden. Sullivan noticed, his brows rose, interesting reaction, recruit. Through the window, the helicopter descended in a controlled dive, kicking up dust and loose papers across the parade ground. Soldiers ran, but not with the casual gait of training. Their strides were sharp, purposeful, urgent. This wasn't routine. Price leaned forward, his expression sharpening into suspicion. "Well, that's telling." Casey's heartbeat thundered. She forced her hands still at her sides, but every nerve screamed at her to move. The door opened, and everything shifted. He entered without knocking. Tall, weathered, the kind of presence that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. His uniform was regulation perfect but bore the subtle modifications only those who'd seen shadow wars carried. His eyes swept the room in one practiced motion, calculating, cataloging, assessing. "Colonel Reed Ashworth, Special Operations Command." "Commander Sullivan," he said, voice steady, deep, commanding. "We need to speak." Sullivan stood at once, bureaucratic authority dissolving in the presence of a man who didn't trade in paperwork. "Of course, Colonel. We were conducting a discharge hearing." Ashworth's gaze shifted to Casey. He held it longer than necessary, longer than safe. Recognition flickered there, not of her face, but of something deeper. A discharge hearing, Ashworth repeated. What are the charges? Blake saw his chance. He stepped forward, voice eager. Sir, the recruit has demonstrated knowledge and skills far beyond her stated background. We believe she falsified her enlistment, possibly for reasons of security, suspicious reasons. Ashworth didn't look at him. He didn't need to. His focus never left Casey. What kind of skills? His voice was calm, almost curious. Blake pushed on. Advanced mechanics, tactical awareness, reflexes, combat reflexes, not something you learn in 3 weeks. Ashworth's eyes narrowed just slightly, but Casey saw it, felt it. Combat reflexes. The words lingered in the air. Ashworth stepped closer, his boots slow, deliberate. Name. Brennan, sir, she said. Casey Brennan. The name hung like a blade between them. Ashworth tested it slow. Brennan, and you're here facing discharge. Yes, sir. He moved closer still, studying her face, her posture, the controlled calm that threatened to fracture under his stare. Then his voice dropped, quieter, intimate. Tell me about the butterfly. The world stopped. Casey's lungs froze, her pulse surged. He knew. Around her the room stirred. Blake's face twisted in confusion and excitement. Sullivan leaned forward. Price tilted his head, eyes sharp. But Casey heard none of it, only Ashworth. The tattoo, he said. On your left collarbone, tell me about it. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The butterfly burned like flame under her uniform. I don't know what you mean, sir. Ashworth's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't kind. It was recognition. Major Casey Brennan, he said quietly, his words striking like bullets. Operation Desert Phoenix, Task Force Shadow, 6 KIA, 1 survivor, Medal of Honor nomination, withdrawn. The silence exploded. Sullivan half rose from his chair, face pale. Blake staggered back like he'd been struck. Price's sharp certainty shattered into something closer to awe or fear. Casey didn't move, couldn't. Her cover was gone, her silence broken, her world cracked wide open. For a moment, she wasn't in Sullivan's office. She was back in the desert. The night they'd been betrayed, the firefight that had torn through sand and stone like the world itself was ending, the voices of her team screaming through smoke, the chaos, the certainty of death. And then silence. 6 gone, 1 left. Sorry. She felt again the blood on her hands as she dragged bodies that wouldn't wake, heard the static-choked radio calls that never reached the men who should have answered, saw the ambush unfold with a precision that could only mean betrayal from inside. The butterfly tattoo had been born from that night, a memorial carved into skin, a promise written in ink. And now Ashworth had spoken its truth aloud. Ashworth circled her like a predator who already knew his prey's heart. The question isn't whether you belong here, Major. The question is, what the hell you're doing here in the first place. Casey's chest ached. Her instincts screamed a dozen different orders: run, deny, fight, confess. She did none of them. She stood still. Because stillness was sometimes the only shield left. Sullivan's voice cracked into the silence. Major, is this true? Ashworth's gaze never left her. The butterfly pressed against her skin, reminding her of 6 ghosts who deserved more than silence. But silence was all she could give. For now. The knock at the door was sharp. Enter, Sullivan called. Harper Coleman stepped inside. Young, clear-eyed, a recruit who had been silent through every whisper, every cruel laugh. Her gaze locked on Casey, and something passed between them, recognition, though not of facts but of truth. Sir, Harper said, I was told testimony was needed regarding recruit Brennan's conduct. Not now, Sullivan began. But Ashworth raised a hand. Actually, I'd like to hear it. Harper stepped forward, voice steady. Sir, I've observed Brennan for 2 weeks. I've seen her under pressure, under sabotage, under harassment. She never retaliated, never complained. Whatever her background, she's conducted herself with honor. If she hid something, it wasn't to cheat, it was to survive. The words landed heavy. Blake shifted, pale now, guilt beginning to bloom like rot under his skin. Ashworth listened, his face unreadable, but his eyes never left Casey. When Harper finished, he nodded once. "Thank you, dismissed." But Casey knew the hearing was already over. The game had changed. Her secret was gone. The hunt had only just begun. What happens when the truth is too heavy to hide, but too dangerous to share? When silence is no longer safety, but speaking may set the world on fire. The door closed behind Harper Coleman, and with it, the weight of witnesses vanished. The room shrank to 3 people, Colonel Ashworth, Commander Sullivan, and Casey Brennan. But it didn't feel small. It felt suffocating. Sullivan sat stiff behind his desk, face pale, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles gleamed white. His earlier bureaucratic confidence had dissolved into something closer to fear. Ashworth didn't sit. He circled, his eyes locked on Casey like a predator taking his time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Major Casey Brennan," he said again, the name deliberate, heavy, undeniable. Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, retired under classified circumstances, officially gone. Unofficially, he stopped in front of her, his eyes narrowing. "Unofficially, you're standing here playing recruit. Why?" Casey didn't answer, not yet. Because the weight of the question wasn't just tactical, it was personal. Her cover was ash now, but her mission was still alive, and the 6 names inked into the wings of the butterfly were screaming in her chest. Sullivan broke the silence, his voice strained. "Colonel, what exactly are we dealing with here? Is this recruit, this major, an imposter, an investigator, or a ghost come back to haunt us?" Ashworth didn't look at him. His focus never left Casey. "I want to hear it from her." Casey's jaw tightened. She wanted to resist, to hold the silence, to carry the weight alone. But 18 months of solitude had already nearly broken her. She exhaled. The words came slow, heavy. "Desert Phoenix." The room froze. Ashworth's expression shifted, not surprise but recognition, confirmation. Sullivan blinked. That was sealed, redacted beyond access, that operation never even. "It existed," Casey cut in, her voice sharper than she intended, "and it was betrayed." The words dropped like a blade into the silence. Flashback. Heat, sand, a horizon that shimmered like glass under the sun. Task Force shadow moved through the dust, 6 soldiers and their officer, Casey. Torres joked about cold beers waiting at home. Kim adjusted his pack, muttering about bad intel. Janet Rodriguez hummed under her breath, a song that carried further than it should have. Marcus Williams whispered prayers no one acknowledged. Amanda Chen rolled her eyes at all of them, the youngest but sharpest. And Thomas Anderson, only 19, wide-eyed, still carrying hope like it was armor. They trusted her, all of them, trusted her to lead them into the fire and back out again. But fire was all they found. The ambush came with surgical precision, mortars before they reached cover, snipers who knew their exact route, machine gun nests positioned where no map had ever marked them. It wasn't chance, it was betrayal. She remembered Kim's scream when shrapnel tore him apart. Tor's last stand behind a burning Humvee. Chen's furious shout into her comms before the static swallowed it. Anderson throwing himself onto a grenade 19 years old, giving his life in a reflex of courage no one had time to honor. 6 gone. 1 dragged herself out, broken but breathing. Casey. The butterfly was born in the weeks after, etched into her collarbone with ink and pain. Each wing line carved for a name, each tiny star for a life extinguished. 6 souls burned into her skin. 6 ghosts she carried into silence. Her voice broke when she returned to the present. They died because someone sold us out, someone with access, someone inside the chain of command. The ambush was too precise, too clean. It was orchestrated. Sullivan swallowed hard. You're telling me you went undercover to find them? Casey nodded once. My retirement was staged, my record buried. They sent me back into the system as a civilian transfer, a fresh recruit. No one would suspect a ghost wearing new boots. Ashworth's jaw tightened, his tone dropped lower. And Fort Davidson. Casey's eyes flicked to Sullivan, then back. Patterns, identical to others I tracked, sabotage, harassment, whispers, methods designed to flush out anyone who doesn't fit. This place isn't just a training ground, it's a sieve. And someone's watching what slips through. Sullivan shifted in his chair. He looked smaller now, dwarfed by truths too large for his desk to contain. You're saying we've been compromised, that our training pipeline. Not just compromised, Casey said softly, weaponized. The word lingered. Ashworth's expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke of calculations racing behind his eyes. Why didn't you come to me sooner? He asked finally. Casey's throat tightened, because I didn't know who I could trust. The room went still. It wasn't accusation, it wasn't defiance, it was fact. Because when betrayal comes from inside, trust becomes a weapon sharper than bullets. Sullivan finally found his voice. Colonel, what do you intend to do with this? Ashworth looked at him, and the weight of his gaze made Sullivan pale further. This isn't a discharge hearing anymore, Commander. This is counterintelligence. What Major Brennan just laid out isn't just her burden. It's ours. He turned back to Casey. Your investigation, how far did you get? Her hand rose unconsciously to the butterfly tattoo, pressing it as if to steady herself. 3 suspects here, all with access to operational intel, all with fingerprints on patterns that match other compromised bases, but I couldn't push harder without exposing myself. Ashworth studied her, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Not anymore, he said. The words landed like a verdict. For the first time in weeks, Casey felt a shift, a crack in the loneliness she had carried since the desert. But it wasn't relief, not yet. Because exposure was a double-edged blade, her enemies now knew she was alive, active, hunting. The storm outside was moving closer, and the 6 ghosts written in her skin were still waiting for justice. What happens when the enemy doesn't wear a uniform you can shoot at? When betrayal hides in plain sight, wearing the same boots, saluting the same flag. The air in Sullivan's office still hummed with what had been spoken. The silence after truth often carries more weight than the truth itself. Casey stood, hands at her sides, her breathing steady, though inside her chest a storm howled. Ashworth leaned closer, voice low, meant only for her. You've named 3 suspects. Casey nodded. Logan Price, Jennifer Walsh, Robert Chen. Each name was a stone dropped in still water, ripples spread. Sullivan flinched at the first. Instructor Price. His voice carried disbelief but also fear. Casey met his gaze. He had access to evaluation reports across multiple programs. He spotted irregularities others would miss. He pressed me harder than necessary, as if trying to confirm suspicions no one should have had unless they were primed. Ashworth's eyes narrowed. He didn't interrupt. Jennifer Walsh, Casey continued. Administrative specialist. She processes personnel files. She would have seen my transfer, seen the gaps. She's quiet, efficient, too efficient. Mistakes don't happen around her, but anomalies vanish from records when she's near them. Sullivan shifted again. His face looked older by the second. And Robert Chen, Casey finished. Supply sergeant. His hands are on everything, comms equipment, vehicles, even secure storage. He signs off on items he shouldn't even know exist. And in Phoenix, she paused, swallowing hard. The ambush only happened because our supply chain was compromised. Ammunition crates mismarked. Radios tuned to wrong frequencies. Someone fed the enemy our rhythm. That's why my team died. Her voice cracked on the last word, just for a second. 6 ghosts pressed against her throat, demanding to be heard. Tors, Kim, Janet, Marcus, Amanda, Anderson. They were here in this sterile office, just as much as she was. Ashworth stepped back, eyes narrowing, his expression unreadable. You've been thorough. Casey lifted her chin. I had to be. The silence stretched, and then Ashworth gave the order Sullivan hadn't been ready for. Pull their files, he said. Every scrap, every commendation, every assignment, and cross-reference it against breaches we know of. Sullivan swallowed, nodded stiffly, and moved to comply. But Casey's chest tightened, because she knew what came next. When you point at snakes in tall grass, the grass always moves. The day bled into night. By the time Casey returned to her barracks, the base felt different. Quieter, but not calmer. It was the kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder. The kind of quiet that belongs to predators in the dark. Recruits barely looked at her now, some with awe, some with fear. Blake kept his distance, but she could feel his stare like a hot brand. Austin Rodriguez avoided her eyes, though his silence was heavy with questions he hadn't dared voice. Only Harper Coleman crossed her path, eyes steady, carrying a quiet loyalty that asked for nothing in return. Are you all right? Harper asked softly, catching her outside the mess hall. Casey hesitated, then lied, I'm fine. But she was. Because in the privacy of her bunk, when the lights dimmed and the storm outside swallowed the sound of boots and engines, she saw them again. Tors, his laugh, deep and booming, cutting through the desert night. He'd been the big brother of the team, the anchor, always first to crack a joke, last to leave a fight. He'd covered their withdrawal that night, bullets tearing into him as he held a line no man could hold. She saw him fall again, heard his final grunt. And she whispered into the dark, I'm not done, Mike, I swear I'm not done. Sleep didn't come easy. Morning returned her to suspicion. The recruits were marched to the range for marksmanship drills, the air sharp with gunpowder. Murphy barked orders, but his eyes cut toward her more often than usual, watching, measuring. Casey loaded her weapon with hands that didn't shake. She fired in bursts, steady, controlled. Targets dropped clean, one after another. Too clean, too steady. Murmurs rose. No rookie shoots like that. She's hiding something. Who the hell is she? She ignored them, but the words wormed deeper than she let show. Murphy walked down the line, his scowl sharper than usual. He stopped behind her, staring at the holes punched dead center in her target. Perfect again, Brennan. His tone was a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. Yes, drill sergeant. His jaw tight, he said nothing more, but his silence said enough. She was being measured by everyone now, and the scales were tilting. Later in the maintenance bay, she found herself alone under the belly of another Abrams. The steel monster loomed above her, familiar, almost comforting. She slid her hands across its innards, the way one might trace scars on their own skin. That's when she felt it. A shift in the air, the sense of being watched. She slid out, rag in hand. The bay looked empty but not quiet. Careful, Brennan, a voice said, smooth, too smooth. She turned. Instructor Price stood at the far end, clipboard in hand, expression calm, too calm. You've been making quite an impression. She kept her voice even. Just doing my job, sir. He smiled thin. That's the thing, you're doing it a little too well. He tapped the clipboard, though his eyes never left hers. I've read recruits, hundreds, thousands. I know when something doesn't fit. Casey's pulse quickened, but her face betrayed nothing. I study hard. The same words she'd given him before. His smile widened slightly, as if savoring her deflection. Study hard. He stepped closer, boots echoing on the concrete. You know what's funny, Brennan? Sometimes the ones who try the hardest to hide are the ones who already know they're exposed. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his eyes. You should be careful. Around here, when someone doesn't fit, the system finds ways to correct it. It wasn't a threat, not exactly. But it wasn't nothing. And in that moment, Casey knew one thing for certain. Logan Price wasn't just suspicious, he was dangerous. That night, Casey found herself packing the perimeter, boots crunching gravel, moonlight spilling across the compound. Her nerves hummed with tension she couldn't release. Harper found her there, arms folded tight against the cold. "You're not fine," Harper said simply. Casey exhaled, a long, heavy breath. "They're closing in," she admitted quietly. "The more I stand out, the tighter the noose gets." "Then why keep standing out?" Casey looked at her, eyes fierce. "Because I don't have a choice. Because 6 people died believing I'd find the truth. Because if I let this go, they died for nothing." Her hand rose to the butterfly tattoo, pressing it through the fabric. Harper's gaze softened, though her jaw set with something like resolve. "Then you won't do it alone." The words were quiet, simple, but they settled deep. And for the first time in months, Casey felt the faintest thread of something she hadn't dared let herself touch. Hope. But hope was dangerous. Because the next morning she woke to find her locker rifled, her boots overturned, her belongings scattered. And taped to the inside of the door, a note scrawled in harsh letters. "We know who you are." The butterfly burned. And Casey knew the storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. What happens when memory becomes more vivid than the present? When the ghosts you carry speak louder than the living around you? Casey stood in the empty locker room, staring at the note taped inside the steel door. "We know who you are." The words weren't a guess. They weren't a whisper in the dark. They were a statement. Someone wasn't just suspicious anymore, they were certain. Her instincts surged, muscles tight, mind racing. The barracks were still asleep, muffled snores behind thin walls, boots lined in neat rows, but the silence pressed down like a trap. She removed the note, folding it once, slipping it into her pocket. No flare of panic, no outward sign, just the cold steadiness of someone who had lived under crosshairs before. But inside, the desert rose up again. Sergeant David Kim had always carried himself with a strange mix of rigidity and warmth, a man who lived by the book but tucked humor between its lines. His Korean accent thickened when he was angry, softened when he laughed, and Casey had leaned on him more than she'd admit. He'd been her second in command, her anchor. He had seen her doubt, her hesitation, and steadied it with blunt words and a half-smile. "You don't get to break first, Brennan," he once told her on a night when exhaustion had stripped her bare. "We break after you do. That's the chain of command. Don't let us down." The ambush had torn him apart before she even reached cover. Mortar fire shredded the ground, and she saw him stumble, his body folding into the sand like it belonged there. She remembered screaming his name, but her voice was drowned in fire. She crawled toward him, smoke choking her lungs, only to see his hand twitch once, twice, then fall still. Kim was gone before she reached him. And she had kept walking. The guilt still clawed at her, even now. The next morning at Fort Davidson, Ashworth pulled her aside near the motor pool. Engines rumbled in the background, recruits moving tanks into position, instructors barking commands. But his voice was quiet, meant only for her. "They made their first move," he said. She didn't flinch, the note. His eyes flicked, just for a second. "I know, don't show it to anyone else. Let them think you're rattled. Sometimes the only way to flush snakes is to let them believe their venom's working." Casey's jaw tightened, "And when they strike again?" Ashworth's gaze hardened. "Then we strike back." It wasn't comfort, it was calculation. But calculation was what she needed. Later that day, she sat in the mess hall, picking at food she couldn't taste. Around her, voices hummed, laughter, arguments, gossip, but all of it blurred under the weight of memory. Janet Rodriguez, the medic, the soul of Task Force Shadow. She had carried more weight in her pack than anyone, not because she was stronger, but because she refused to let anyone else go without. Bandages, morphine, IV kits, her bag was a walking hospital. Janet's smile was quick and sharp, her Puerto Rican humor laced with sarcasm that cut even as it comforted. She called Casey Jeffa, boss, but with affection. She carried music on her lips, humming old boleros even under fire. The night of the ambush, Janet had been the one who dragged Marcus when his leg gave out. She had screamed at Casey to move, to cover, to keep pushing. Casey remembered the sound of bullets tearing into Janet's chest, the way she refused to fall until Marcus was clear. Her body collapsed only when she had nothing left to give. And even then, Casey remembered seeing her hand still reaching for someone else's wound. She pressed her palms into the mess hall table, forcing herself to breathe, forcing herself to stay here in Fort Davidson, not there, not bleeding in the sand with Janet's lifeless body. The butterfly burned again. 6 wings, 6 ghosts. And Janet was screaming loudest tonight. That evening, drills stretched long. Sweat poured, boots pounded mud, commands echoed across the training field. Blake Harrison watched her again, suspicion sharpening into something else. He had once wanted her gone for ego. Now he wanted her gone because her presence unsettled him. When the run ended, Blake cornered her near the water station, his grin wolfish. "You think you're clever, Brennan. You're not. Someone's already onto you, and when they drag you out, don't expect anyone to save you." Casey's face didn't shift. Her voice was calm, low. "Careful, Blake. You're a pawn in a game you don't even see." For the first time, his grin faltered, just for a second. And Casey knew she had struck something true. That night she dreamed of Amanda Chen. Amanda had been the youngest of the 6, barely 21, sharp eyes behind wire-frame glasses, a sniper who could split a playing card from half a mile. Her quiet was often mistaken for shyness, but Amanda's silence was weaponized. She heard more than anyone else, saw more. Amanda had confided in Casey once, on a lonely outpost watch. "Sometimes I wonder if they'll ever know what we did out here, if it'll matter." Casey had told her it mattered, always. But Amanda never lived to hear proof. She had been up on overwatch when the first mortar struck. Casey had looked up in time to see the tower explode, flames licking the sky, Amanda's body swallowed whole. The sniper who had seen everything never saw her own end coming. Casey woke with a gasp, sweat cold on her skin, the ceiling above her swimming. The butterfly burned again. Tors Kim Janet Amanda. 4 wings screaming. 2 left. At dawn, Sullivan called a closed meeting. Ashworth, Casey, and a stack of files spread across the table. "Price, Walsh, Chen," Sullivan said, voice brittle. "We've pulled their records, on paper all clean, commendations, perfect scores, glowing evaluations." Ashworth didn't look surprised. Paper trails can be made perfect. He pushed the files aside, his eyes locking on Casey. "What you've seen, what you felt, it matters more than paper. You're the one who lived through betrayal. You know the scent of it." Casey felt her chest tighten. He was asking her to trust her instincts, the very thing she had been forced to hide since the desert. And instincts carried weight. She exhaled. "Price is careful, too careful. He pushes recruits until they break, not to test them but to measure how much they can hide. That's not teaching. That's surveillance." She tapped Walsh's file. "Walsh erases anomalies. I checked twice. I submitted paperwork with deliberate mistakes. They vanished. She made them disappear. That's not diligence. That's cover." Her hand hovered over Chen's folder. "And Chen, supply chains don't lie. I traced shipment logs last week. Gear routed wrong. Radio's mismatched frequencies, same patterns from Phoenix. He's either sloppy, her voice hardened, or he's feeding intel. Sullivan rubbed his temples, the weight dragging him down. If you're right, that means Davidson isn't a base. It's a sieve, and we've been training with the enemy's eyes inside our walls. Ashworth leaned back, arms crossed, expression grim. Not for long. Casey's heart pounded. The circle was tightening. But snakes bite hardest when cornered. And she knew the strike was coming. That night she found her bunk stripped, sheets gone, pillow missing. And on the mattress, scratched into the fabric with the tip of a blade, 5 words. "The next ghost is you." Casey stared at it in silence, her fists clenching, the butterfly screaming against her skin. Her 6 ghosts had waited long enough. And the storm was about to break. What happens when you finally face the last ghosts? When there's no one left to remember but you, and no silence deep enough to bury them. Casey sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the threat carved into her mattress. "The next ghost is you." The words glowed in her mind, sharper than steel. She didn't move for a long time, didn't tear the fabric, didn't tell anyone. She just sat in the dim light, hand pressed against her collarbone, the butterfly tattoo burning like fire under her skin. 6 wings, 6 souls. Tors, Kim, Janet, Amanda. 4 already screaming through her. 2 left. And they weren't going to stay silent much longer. Marcus Williams had been the eldest of Task Force Shadow. 40, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a weight in his shoulders from carrying too many tour. A father of 3, his pockets always stuffed with folded paper, crayon drawings from kids who didn't understand why Daddy had to leave. Marcus was steady, patient, the team's backbone. He spoke less, listened more, and when he did speak, the words mattered. "Don't rush," he'd told Casey once as she tried to lead them through a village checkpoint. "Sometimes holding still is harder than pulling the trigger, but it saves more lives." She'd taken that lesson with her, held it close. And yet, when the ambush came, Marcus never got to use stillness. Casey saw it again in her mind. The blast tearing through their cover, Marcus shielding 2 of them with his own body. His last act wasn't a fight, it was to protect. He'd fallen with his children's drawings still stuffed in his pocket. Casey had dug them out later, trembling, stained with blood. She still saw the crayon suns, the stick figures with Daddy written under them. She had folded them back into his pocket before leaving him in the sand. And she had never forgiven herself. The memory bled into another. Thomas Anderson, 19, barely out of high school, a boy with a rifle too big for his frame, eyes too wide for the desert, and a grin that never faded even when things turned dark. He had followed Casey like a shadow, always asking questions, always trying to prove himself. "Ma'am, do you think I'll ever be good enough?" He'd asked her one night by the fire, his voice nervous but eager. "You already are," she'd told him, and she had meant it. But words couldn't save him. When the grenade landed near their position, Thomas hadn't hesitated. He hadn't waited for orders. He'd thrown himself on it, arms outstretched, face set in grim determination. 19 years old, one heartbeat of courage. And then silence. The blast had thrown Casey back, ringing in her ears, burning her skin. When she'd opened her eyes, all that remained of him was pieces. And she had screamed, not like a soldier, like a sister, like a mother, like a woman who had promised her team she'd bring them home and failed. The butterfly's final wing had been carved for him. 6 names, 6 deaths. And Casey left to carry them all. She pressed her palms to her eyes, dragging herself back to the present. The barracks were quiet, but her heart was thunder. The butterfly no longer burned, it blazed. And she knew, with a clarity sharper than any blade, that her ghosts weren't demanding remembrance anymore. They were demanding justice. The next morning, Ashworth was waiting by the motor pool. His posture was rigid, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes flicked to her with a weight that said he knew. He always seemed to know. "They're escalating," he said without preamble. "That note in your bunk, that wasn't just intimidation. That was testing you, seeing if you'd flinch." "I didn't," Casey said quietly. "No," his voice carried a trace of respect. "You didn't, which means they'll move harder, faster." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "We can't rely on paper. Price, Walsh, Chen, they've covered their tracks too well. If we're going to prove this, we need to catch them moving. In real time." Casey felt her chest tighten. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore. It was here, coiled, ready to strike. "How?" Ashworth's eyes narrowed. "We set a trap." That afternoon, Walsh approached her in the admin office. Casey had been reviewing training reports when Walsh appeared, her smile sharp, too polite. "Recruit Brennan," she said, her tone honeyed. "Funny thing, there's been a mistake in your file. Thought you'd want to know." Her eyes gleamed as she handed Casey a folder. The papers inside were pristine, but Casey knew the game. This wasn't a mistake. It was bait. She forced a smile. "Thank you, ma'am." Walsh's gaze lingered, her lips curving. "Be careful. Not everything in records is what it seems." When she walked away, Casey's pulse hammered. Walsh had shown her hand. She knew more than she should. The trap was already springing. That evening in the supply depot, Casey caught Chen checking crates. His hands moved too quickly, his eyes darting when he thought no one was watching. She lingered in the shadows, silent. He relabeled boxes, changed tags, adjusted manifests. The same trick she had seen in Phoenix. Her jaw clenched, her fists curled. She wanted to step forward, to drag him into the open, to scream that 6 people had died because of men like him. But she stayed still, because stillness saved more lives than pulling the trigger. Marcus's lesson. And she wasn't done saving yet. That night, Ashworth gathered her in a dim briefing room, lights low, files spread across the table like weapons. "They're moving," she told him, voice tight. "Walsh baited me. Chen's already tampering with supply logs." Ashworth nodded. "Price has been requesting your evaluation scores from every department. He's building a file. He wants something concrete to bring higher." Casey's pulse surged. "They're closing in." "They are," Ashworth's eyes locked on hers, "but so are we." The silence stretched. And then Ashworth leaned forward, his tone low, deadly. "Tomorrow we let them think they've won. We let them strike, and when they do—" He paused, letting the weight of it hang. "We strike back." Casey exhaled, her hand pressing against the butterfly one more time. 6 ghosts, 6 promises. And tomorrow the reckoning would begin. What happens when silence finally breaks? When the truth, long hidden, is forced into the open, no matter the cost. The morning broke sharp and cold. Fog clung to the parade ground, boots crunching against gravel as recruits fell into line. The base felt different today, as if the air itself carried warning. Casey moved through it quietly, calm on the outside, fire within. She knew this day had been coming. Ashworth's plan wasn't just strategy, it was inevitability. Snakes cornered always strike. And today they would. The trap was simple, training exercise, nothing unusual on the surface. Walsh would process the orders. Chen would manage the supplies. Price would supervise the recruits. Each would have an opportunity to act. Each would think no one was watching. But someone was. Casey. And Ashworth in the shadows, pulling threads only he could see. The recruits marched to the range. Casey kept her eyes forward, her heartbeat steady, but her senses sharpened like blades. Blake marched near her, still muttering under his breath, still desperate to see her fail. He didn't know the game was far bigger than his ego. Price stood at the front, arms crossed, scanning the formation with that scalpel gaze of his. His eyes lingered on her, cold and certain. "This isn't training anymore," he said, voice low but carrying. "This is where we separate the real from the fake." The words were meant for everyone, but his eyes never left Casey. She felt the butterfly burn under her uniform, 6 ghosts pressing against her ribs, urging her forward. While the recruits fired at targets, Walsh slipped away from the admin tent. Casey caught it in her periphery, her instincts prickling. She excused herself under the pretense of maintenance, shadowing Walsh's steps. Inside, Walsh worked quickly, fingers moving across a terminal. Records pulled, altered, erased. Casey stood just beyond the doorway, silent, watching. She saw her own file pulled up, saw whole lines vanish with keystrokes, her existence rewritten in real time. Casey's fists clenched. But she didn't move, not yet. Because predators reveal themselves best when they think no one's watching. In the supply depot, Chen moved crates with deliberate precision. Radios switched, ammo cases mislabeled, the same tricks that had killed 6 of hers in the desert. Casey caught him through the cracked door, her pulse roaring in her ears. And for a moment, she wasn't in Davidson anymore. She was back in Phoenix. She saw Kim torn apart, Janet screaming, Amanda swallowed by fire, Marcus shielding them, Anderson throwing himself on a grenade, Torres holding the line until nothing was left. All because someone like Chen had changed a tag, misrouted a signal, handed their position to the enemy. Her vision blurred, her throat burned. And she almost stepped in, almost ended it right there. But Ashworth's words anchored her. Let them think they've won, then strike back. She stayed still. Marcus's lesson, stillness saves more lives. The breaking point came that afternoon. Price assembled the recruits on the parade ground. His tone was different today, harder, edged with something almost triumphant. "We've been watching," he said, eyes flicking across the line. "We've been measuring, and today the fraud will be exposed." Murmurs rippled through the recruits. Blake's smirk widened. Harper stood straighter, her jaw tight, eyes darting toward Casey. Price stepped closer. His boots struck the pavement like drumbeats. "Brennan," he said, voice cutting, "step forward." Casey did, calm, silent. "You don't belong here," Price said, his words sharp enough to slice. "You've hidden long enough, and it ends now." The recruits whispered, eyes wide. Ashworth stepped from the shadows then, his presence swallowing the space. His voice was steel. "No, Price, what ends now is your game." The silence cracked. Sullivan appeared beside him, files in hand. Walsh's edits restored, Chen's falsified logs exposed, evidence laid bare. And then Casey moved. Her voice was steady, low, carrying across the formation. "Price, Walsh, Chen, you've been feeding the enemy. You killed 6 of mine in Phoenix, and now you're here poisoning Davidson." Gasps rippled. Blake froze, his smirk gone. Harper's eyes widened. Price's mask cracked, just a flicker. His jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his side. Chen stiffened, sweat beading on his brow. Walsh's face paled, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. Ashworth's command voice cut through the tension. "Military police, now." Boots thundered. Armed MPs surged forward, rifles steady. Price didn't move. He stared at Casey, his eyes burning with hatred and something else. Recognition. "You should have stayed dead," he hissed. And in that moment, Casey knew. Price had known Phoenix. He hadn't just been complicit, he had been there. The butterfly blazed on her skin. 6 ghosts screamed in unison. And Casey stepped forward, her voice breaking with fury and grief. "I carry them every day, every night, and they stand here with me now. You didn't silence them, you never will." Price flinched, just for a moment. Then the MPs forced him to his knees. Walsh wept as cuffs clicked around her wrists. Chen muttered excuses, lies falling like ash. But it didn't matter. The snakes had been pulled from the grass. The storm was over. Later the base was quiet, too quiet. The recruits whispered, but their fear had shifted, not toward her anymore, but toward the truth that had cracked open in their own walls. Casey stood alone by the motor pool, the sun sinking, painting the sky in bruised colors. Ashworth joined her, silent for a long while. "They'll face trial," he said finally, "and the rot they were part of will be dug out. That much I promise." Casey nodded. Her hand rose to the butterfly tattoo, pressing gently against it. "It won't bring them back," she said quietly. "No," Ashworth agreed, "but it honors them, and sometimes that's the best we get." The silence stretched, heavy but not hopeless. Harper approached then, hesitant but steady. "Ma'am," she asked softly. Casey turned. "Thank you," Harper said simply. And Casey saw something in her eyes, something she had once seen in Anderson's, in Amanda's, in all of them before the desert stole them away. Belief. Hope. She swallowed hard, unable to answer, but nodded once. Harper left. Ashworth remained. His voice was low, thoughtful. "You could leave now, disappear again, or you could stay, train them, lead them, show them what survival looks like." Casey looked at the horizon, the last light burning the sky. Her 6 ghosts pressed against her heart. And for the first time the weight eased. Not gone, never gone, but shared. She exhaled, long and steady. "Sometimes," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." Ashworth said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peace.